Hello everyone. Hope everyone is doing well today. Today we're going to continue our lesson on ancient Mesopotamian cultures, and we're going to study the Sumerians today. Just a quick reminder, these are just casual ASMR videos. I get this information from scholarly sources like universities and museums and stuff like that. So any other information that hasn't been confirmed by that, I'm probably not going to put in. This is just a tool kind of used to help with relaxation. So if I leave something out or you think that I've offended the history, I'm really sorry. But really this is just for ASMR, and I try to make sure that the facts are correct, but I'm not really concerned about getting every piece of information into the lessons. So let's talk about the ancient Sumerians, and I hope that you enjoy this lesson. So they think the Sumerians kind of settled between 4500 and 4000 BCE. The earliest people were known as the Ubaid people, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing this completely correct. The Ubaid people were known for farming and raising cattle. They were also known for weaving textiles. And they also did pottery and carpentry. And there was evidence that they enjoyed their lives and did things like drink beer. So this was an interesting setup because unlike a suburban community today that's revolves around a city, the villages kind of surrounded the farming areas, and those were kind of the suburban areas where people lived. But they just surrounded, because the farming areas is the main hub of the entire civilization. By 3000, the Sumerians were, you could say, in control of the region. They had language, they had a rich culture, they had trade, they had all these things that made it easy for them to kind of run this area. During this time, they had different areas known as city-states, which I'm sure we've heard this word even in when you were in school, So these city-states included Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, Kish, and the most important region, Uruk, which sounds like a Lord of the Rings word. Sounds like Uruk-hai, the orcs. So whatever, it doesn't matter. This right here is considered the first true city. Right here. In 2800 BCE, this city had a population of between 40,000 and 80,000. Obviously, we just have to estimate this because we can't possibly know unless they recorded the population, which they probably couldn't. They didn't have a census, they couldn't count how many people there were probably at that time. Maybe the largest city in the world. At the time. So each of these city-states were run, they were like formed because of local deities. And we talked about this in the lesson about Mesopotamia, but how at this time the population was kind of run by like religious figures, like priests. So this is before kings came in, which that will happen here pretty soon. Just as like a side note, Sumerian, the name Sumerian was given to them by the Akkadians. They said that this name, the Sumerians, meant the land of civilized kings. But the actual Sumerians themselves said that it meant the land, or the land of the dark-haired people. That's what they thought. So interestingly enough, each of these city-states had a wall surrounding it. So each region had its own like wall. So now we're going to talk about language. So the Sumerians invented the oldest known and recorded written language. So this language was known as cuneiform. You've probably heard of that. And it was comprised of a lot of like kind of shape looking symbols. So, which we know now, letters technically are just like symbols we invented, right? This showed up around 3100 BCE. This form of writing kind of ran the region for about 1,000 years before the Akkadians came in. Might have to get more room here. So we're on language. The Akkadians came in after about 1,000 years of cuneiform kind of dominating the region. So they came in and adapted the language to create a new one, which was the Akkadian writing system and language. There's evidence that cuneiform actually went on for another 2,000 years after this. This style of writing was considered to be like a series of symbols that were put on tablets. And these tablets have gone back until 4000 BCE. That's the oldest ones that they found, and that's over 6,000 years ago. So they were writing cuneiform symbols about 6,000 years ago. When the Akkadians came in here and adapted the language to Akkadian, this spread all throughout Mesopotamia and actually beyond. People knew of this writing system outside of Mesopotamia, we know now. So that's really interesting. But it's like this version and not original cuneiform symbols. This allowed the Sumerians to keep meticulous records. Eventually they had kings in these regions running the city-states, and so they had records of like farming, leaders, events, things like that. The Sumerians were also thought to have had a really rich culture of literary works. And this is because fragments of these works have been found, but no complete work has been found. So they know that they had intricate writing, literary pieces, which is really cool. But they don't have any like full work, and that makes sense because it was so long ago. And the environment's like changed around there, so if anything was like buried, it might not exist anymore. We just don't know. So now we're going to talk about architecture. Oops, I didn't spell that right. That was weird. Sometimes my E's look like C's. And with this, I'm also going to talk about art, because it kind of is super related. It's just like a lot of art has to do and began with decorating pieces of architecture and buildings and things like that. So the architecture of Mesopotamia actually began at around 1500 BCE, and this is with buildings that were made from bundles of marsh reeds and clay bricks, like clay mud bricks, which that's very common for early civilizations to have made bricks out of some kind of like clay or mud. These, although they were improved upon, of course, throughout the centuries, they were kind of had a specific look, and that look was like a flat roof and arched doorways. Around 3400 BCE is when we start to see religious buildings being constructed. And they think that kind of Sumeria they kind of started the idea of large-scale construction and also intricate construction of buildings, because they also started terracotta, like that design style. They also did like bronze reliefs. They did like mosaics, which is, kind of like the little tiles that they arrange. They did like paintings and made like huge brick columns. So they really had a lot going for them when it comes to like their artistic ability and putting that into like an architectural setting. And so that was really interesting how they kind of started like these bronze. They also had like bronze like embellishments and stuff on the terracotta and like the buildings. And so really, really pretty cool stuff they were coming up with. We also talked about this in the introduction to Mesopotamia, but this region had very little access to stone. So they did a lot of metal casting as an art form and as a form of decoration for like buildings. Before I go into more of the like intricate details of the Sumerian culture, I just kind of wanted to break it up into like a Sumerian timeline that historians have kind of made to make it easier to understand. So we've talked about this period, the Ubaid period, which was considered between 5,000 and 4,100 BCE. The next period is the Uruk period, which we've kind of talked about here a little bit, and that's going to be from 4,100 to 29. So we're kind of working up to this right here. The early dynastic period, and this is like very reminiscent of how we've organized Egyptian history, if you remember those lessons. And this was from about 29 to 2334 BCE. Now, after this point, because a lot of people say that this is kind of when real Sumerian culture ended, because the Akkadians took over. So the Akkadian period was from 2334 to about 2218 BCE. So it wasn't very long, and this is kind of an indication that this region was going to be taken over, and the specific Sumerian culture kind of like disappeared, and those people just eventually became Akkadian people. And again, we've seen that a million times throughout history. I do think it's great that cuneiform kind of kept going for a while. And then I do think it's cool that, they kind of made their language off of like a version of cuneiform, because that does kind of keep it going, although the original version was lost. I mean, we found it a long time later, but at that time it was kind of just like phased out. That happens a lot. Because then there is the Gutian period, which was from about 2218. And see, this isn't a very long time. So it's really just like being conquered by one civilization and then being conquered by the next civilization. And that's why they kind of renamed the periods, because change is happening. And a lot of the time that's because of like invasion. Then there's the Ur 3 period. And this has also been known as the Sumerian Renaissance. So this was from 2047 to 1750 BCE. So this was a much longer period of time. This time right here, this is when like that civilization's time in history was completely over. So they were done at this point. Sumeria had kind of disappeared into the ether, as had a lot of other civilizations that we'll also talk about at that time. But we're going to kind of get back. So we're kind of concentrating here on like this. Because this right here, we're going to talk about the Akkadians, and they kind of took over Sumeria. So the Sumerians, after like a generation, became Akkadians pretty much. And so we're going to kind of include that in the Akkadian history as well, because that all kind of like meshes together when it comes to like information on history. That's not like distinct. There's not a distinguished difference between the two. Not enough that we can like derive any kind of like important information when it comes to differences between the two. So we're going to kind of move on to more things. So we're kind of like right here and at the end of here still. So the Sumerians were responsible for essentially inventing time, like modern time. How we know time today. So they divided day and night into 24-hour periods. I love stuff like this because I always think it's so interesting to find out like the origins of why we do things the way we do them now. So this is right up my alley. So they also divided hours into 60 minutes. And they divided minutes into 60 seconds. Very consistent. So now we're going to talk about innovations in pottery. So many civilizations in ancient times made pottery by hand. The Sumerians were the first ones to invent the turning wheel, which I can tell you from experience makes it a lot easier and faster. We've also talked about like farming in Mesopotamia and how they invented irrigation, but that was actually the Sumerians. So the Sumerians figured out how to channel water from the rivers into these like little trenches that they made that would flow into like their crops and next to their homes so they could gather water. When I was in South America, I was young. I think I was 21, but I was doing archaeology in Peru, and we were working in pre-Inca civilizations, and we actually found, or technically I guess I was the one who discovered like this series of channels, and we didn't know this yet, but they had created like it was like the Moche had created this ancient channel and irrigation, and it was really cool. It was like the only thing I ever really like discovered. So that was pretty neat. They also constructed dams with like palm trunks and reeds and mud to create like a door that they could open and shut. So they kind of like figured out that they could do that, which is interesting. We've talked about the chariot with Mesopotamia. That was the Sumerians. They are not credited with inventing the wheel, the Sumerians. They are credited with inventing a chariot that probably used 2 wheels and could like carry people. Part of this was it was being pulled by animals. But they actually think that because the terrain around the area was so rough, they actually didn't use these for transportation. They probably used it for like ceremonies, or by like the military. As like a kind of like a decoration or like a way to like show someone off, kind of, you know, a ceremony, like someone who's a leader or like a religious figure can kind of be displayed. So they think that that's probably where they use them, and they didn't actually use them for transportation. So the plow, the Sumerian plow, was very unique. Actually, multiple types of plows. And with this, they also came up with this like prayer, which I think is great, to like this field mouse deity. So it wouldn't like eat their crops after they plowed the ground, and they would like do this prayer before they did their plow. The Sumerians were the first to gather wool in Mesopotamia to be used for weaving. So they were the first to kind of think of that and how they could weave this wool, like make it into a like a spool of like thread and make it into a fabric. They would make clothing on like an industrial scale. Sell it or trade it, probably for trading. You know, there's no evidence that they had any kind of like currency or anything, but there may have been something that they found very valuable. So kind of like spondulus was very valuable in like super ancient some South American civilizations. So because they didn't have stone, the Sumerians were the first to kind of invent molds for clay bricks. So they didn't have to make the bricks by hand. They were very like innovative that way. They came up with the wheel to make it faster. And they came up with a mold to making bricks faster. So you didn't have to sit there and like shape them into the same relative size and shape. So they say that like they weren't as like sturdy as stone. But they were able to manufacture buildings much faster than people who would manufacture stone buildings. And that was made them able to create larger cities faster. The Sumerians were also one of the first people to use copper as like a tool. So they made like spearheads, chisels, razors, which is scary. And then they also used it for like art and adorning things, embellishing things. They sculpted with it. One really important thing that the Sumerians were credited with inventing was schools. They thought it was important to pass knowledge down to masses. And they thought it was important that people be educated for their own lives. They understood that this knowledge was important to like keep a society running. They were also known for like poetry, for amazing poetry. And part of this may have been because of like passing down information and education. They believed that a lot of this poetry was influential when it came to stories in the Bible, like the Great Flood. The Garden of Eden. And the Tower of Babel. So they think that these poems or these stories were hugely influential in stories that were written in the Bible. There is evidence that there actually was a really big flood in that region. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. They also did a lot with music. And there's actually a song called Hurrian Hymn Number 6. Which is considered to be the oldest song in the world ever written. So that's pretty interesting also. Okay, so now we're going to talk about rulers of Sumeria. So the very first ruling body of Sumer that we know of is in the first dynasty. And this is in Kish, which we talked about as one of the regions. The ruler was called Etana of Kish. So this was the first ruler that we know of. Kish, Etana of Kish, was considered to have stabilized all lands, and that is written as like in cuneiform as something that he did. He stabilized all lands. They loved this ruler so much that 1,000 years later they would memorialize him in like a poem of a story of his adventures in heaven. So the most famous is Gilgamesh, and I'm sure most people have heard of Gilgamesh. There's something called the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I'm sure people have heard about that. This was the king of Uruk, which we talked about was the first Sumerian real city. So Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk, which these are all, again, I'm reading the Sumerian, so everything's Lord of the Rings now. So he was in control around 2700 BCE, and the Epic of Gilgamesh is actually like a story of his adventures. During this poem, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Great Flood is actually mentioned in this poem. So that was a theme that they took over to like the Bible. So sometime around 2600 BCE, there started to be some kind of like political turmoil, and there was a power struggle between Kish, Eric, and Ur. And we talked about all these regions just a little bit ago. So the Kish lost control and then got it back briefly. You know, this was taken over by another king, and then it was taken over by another king for like 90 years, all whose names I cannot pronounce and or write, but it's just kind of like being passed around. In 2500 BCE was the only woman to rule, and her name was Kubaba. And she ruled Sumeria at this time, which is great. So there was like her son and grandson took control for a while. And we talked about this date in 2234 BCE. 2234. This is when Sargon took over. So this is the end of this time where Mesopotamia kind of like had its own rulers and stuff like that. Sargon was an Akkadian. So Sargon, there was a legend about Sargon, and many think that he may have like started this story himself to create like some kind of legend. And that legend says that he was born to a high priestess who placed him in a basket and placed him in a river and cast him down the river. That story was used in the story of Moses for the Old Testament. So that's kind of where this came from. So it seems like Sargon thought pretty highly of himself. He rose from a gardener his father was a gardener, and so he didn't have any like status, and he rose to the place of a cupbearer for the king. I think we're going to stop there because once we get into Sargon, it's kind of like its own whole thing. We'll talk about Acadia next time, and he's going to come up because he's the king of Acadia, and he kind of came to Sumeria and took over. And so a lot of the rest of Sumerian history is kind of intertwined in Sargon, and then after that they were taken over again and again. So that's all gonna kind of be like related. So I hope that you enjoyed this lesson as much as I enjoyed teaching it, and so I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.